quarterback, student body president. He could have succeeded within the confines that were determined for him and had a successful life. But like so many of his generation, so many extraordinary civil rights leaders in the late 50s and 60s, that Joshua generation, he instinctively understood that individual success meant nothing unless everybody was free. So he became inspired by the bus boycotts in Montgomery. He led 7 black students into the whites-only library, sitting down and getting arrested for reading. Think about that. The library closed, but then it reopened. And when it did, it was open to everyone. Send me, Jesse said, even as a young man, and the world got a little bit better. By the time Reverend Jackson graduated from college, he had attended Chicago Theological Seminary. He knew the nature of his calling, and he became, as everybody knows, the youngest member of SCLC, assigned to lead Operation Breadbasket here in Chicago, right around the time that Isaiah Thomas is talking about. And it was during this period, and especially after Dr. King's death, when the optimism of the early movement had begun to fade and leadership had begun to fracture, and when the country seemed to have grown bored, gotten weary of the idea of justice and equality, and moved on to other concerns, that Reverend Jackson rose above despair and kept that righteous flame alive. Through Operation Push, he led boycotts and challenged corporate policies around hiring and contracting, recognizing that civil rights without economic justice was an empty promise. He backed unions in their organizing efforts and activists in fair wage campaigns, understanding that if the have-nots and the have-little bits ever learned to make common cause across racial lines instead of fighting each other over breadcrumbs, everybody would benefit. He helped register millions of voters. He fought against biases in the criminal justice system. He drew attention to local abuses of power and called folks at the national level to account. And by the early 80s, he was delivering that message of change and hope across the globe, freeing hostages from captivity, fighting to end apartheid in South Africa. And then, in 1984, as the powers that be in Washington were rolling back hard-won progress, slashing the social safety net, when more and more folks were getting left behind, and greed was being trumpeted as a virtue. See, we've been there before. He stepped forward once again and said, "Send me." He ran for the presidency of the United States of America. I had just graduated from college during that first campaign. And I was living in New York at the time. I was working to pay off my student loans, eating a lot of tuna fish and Campbell soup. And if I went to a diner, you know, I'd grab some extra crackers, put them in my pocket. And I was inspired by the civil rights movement. And I had in my mind to work for social justice. But even though I was full of good intentions, I was uncertain of how to serve and fighting off self-doubt. And I remember how, at the time, plenty of people, including, plenty of black folks, were dismissing Jesse's chances, suggesting, oh, he just wants attention, he can only get black votes. But then I remember one night sitting in my janky apartment, and I got an old black and white TV with the rabbit ears, and I'm kind of jiggering around, and it's about this big. I know young people can't imagine, but the TV was about this big. And I'm watching the Democratic primary debate between him and Walter Mondale and Gary Hart. And I remember how, when that debate was over, I turned off that TV and I thought the same thing that I know a lot of people thought that night, even if they didn't want to admit it. That in his ideas, in his platform, in his analysis, in his intelligence, in his insight, Jesse hadn't just held his own. He had owned that stage. He wasn't an intruder. He wasn't a pretender. He belonged on that stage. And the message he sent to a 22-year-old child of a single mother with a funny name, an outsider, was that maybe there wasn't any place, any room where we didn't belong. And that message of fairness and dignity, of justice and hope, that's what the Rainbow Coalition was all about. In 1984, and then again in 1988, Jesse didn't just speak to black folks, he spoke to white folks and Latinos and Asian Americans and the First Americans. He spoke to family farmers and environmentalists. He spoke to gay rights activists when nobody was talking to gay rights activists, and blue-collar workers. And he gave them the same message, that they mattered, that their voices and their votes counted. He invited them to believe. He invited us to believe in our own power to change America for the better. By the delegate count, Jesse's two candidacies ultimately came up short. But he paved the road for so many others to follow. Doug Wilder became the first elected black governor. Carol Moseley Braun went to the U.S. Senate. Because of Jesse, the Democratic Party changed its rules, ending the winner-take-all distribution of delegates during presidential primaries, which meant underdogs and outsiders like Bill Clinton or Bernie Sanders could stay competitive and build momentum instead of getting knocked out early. And it was because of that path that he had laid, because of his courage, his audacity, that 2 decades later, a young black senator from Chicago's South Side would even be taken seriously as a candidate for the presidential nomination. I still credit that first run of Jesse's and Harold Washington's campaign for drawing me to Chicago. And I didn't know anybody when I first arrived. And I was working as a community organizer, as it so happens, in neighborhoods right around here. Roseland, Woodlawn, Alt Gill, West Pullman. And I'm meeting these young preachers like Meeks and some crazy priest named Flager. And I guess Jenkins was running around, but he's kind of young. He came a little bit later, so I'm going to churches and I'm listening to all these amazing preachers, and it was hard work, and half the time I didn't know what I was doing, and progress was slow, and I definitely didn't know how I was going to survive these Chicago winters, because I grew up in Hawaii. But I do remember heading to the Push headquarters some Saturday mornings to listen and learn from Reverend Jackson. And y'all remember how on some mornings, if there was a major issue going on, the room would be packed to the rafters. And sometimes some celebrity just wanders in. And then some mornings it was kind of low-key. Either way, though, the announcements would be made, and Reverend Barrow would say a prayer, and Jesse would sit there, and then finally he'd gather himself up and stand, and he'd start kind of slow, you know, and sometimes he'd talk kind of low, so you couldn't quite catch what he was saying, so everybody lean in. And over time, it was that same boundless energy that would emerge, and that same passion and that same insight. And he'd offer you a master class in economics on a Saturday morning. And he'd give you a seminar in American history and American politics. And he'd make complicated things plain. And he'd tell stories that would make you laugh 1 minute and cry the next. And whether you were a bus driver or a teacher or a business leader or a young organizer, you came away from those meetings with a better understanding of how the world worked, how power worked. And more importantly, he made you believe that if we came together, we could make the world work better. Now, we've been talking about Jesse telling us we are somebody. I am somebody. And he wasn't just